Hey everyone, welcome to this very first episode of Best and Worst. My name is John, and A Link to the Past is one of my favorite games of all time. It's definitely my favorite Zelda of all time, so I couldn't think of another game that would be a better fit for this first episode in the series. So I've recently started playing the randomized version of Link to the Past as well, and if you're not familiar with the randomized version, it's basically, it swaps the items and some of the maps and compasses and stuff around in the dungeons and on the overworld. I'll put a link in the description below to kind of give you an idea. But basically, I want this to be the vanilla version of the game that we're looking at for Best and Worst. And I'll probably do a randomized version of this as well in the future. But just so everybody knows, basically I take the 5 best and the 5 worst things in a given game. And it's games like this that are really good. I'm not going to be looking at, it's not really the worst of a game. It's more of the most annoying or the most frustrating aspects of it. I still love this game, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, at least with the worst things. So you're probably not going to agree with me, and that's fine. I want you guys to go in the comments section below. Let me know what your 5 best and 5 worst things are from A Link to the Past. And just don't be a jerk, keep it nice, and I will be checking them and seeing what you guys think. Alright, well, it's time to get into it. This is the best and worst from A Link to the Past.
Number 5 best.
A Link to the Past has some pretty incredible dungeons, and if I was going to be ranking the best dungeons in the Zelda series, I'm sure quite a few of these would be pretty high on that list. But I don't think any of them are better, in my mind, than Turtle Rock. And in some ways, it's really hard to explain why I like Turtle Rock so much. I think it's a bunch of different things. One being that it's an incredibly hard dungeon. It looks a lot different from the other ones. It's like you're going through a cave system. Using the Cane of Samaria to make platforms, I thought was a cool mechanic. And then you have to be on your toes, lighting torches in the air, navigating in the dark, a maze-like system. You have the laser bridge, which I think is pretty iconic in this game. The boss at the end, Trinex, is incredible. And just the overall feel of going over top of the lava, going outside of the dungeon. There's so many things that I think make this dungeon a really incredible experience.
Number 5 worst.
So this is a slight issue that I have with most new Zelda games, is that you're given a ton of items in your inventory, and a lot of them do the same thing, or they're just not used very often. A lot of the newer games have this issue. Twilight Princess is really notorious for this, with a few of their items being the ball and chain, the spinner, and a few others where you only use it in the dungeon that you get the item, and you hardly use it again after that. A Link to the Past isn't quite as bad with this. A lot of the dungeon items you do use, bow, the hook shot, the fire rod, you'll use that in a lot of different situations. But there are a handful of items that I just don't see a reason for having them in the inventory. They just kind of take up space. A few of those, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but the blue cane and the magic cape are kind of the same thing. They could be combined together. I think the bug catcher net could be completely removed, and you could just swing the bottles and catch the fairies that way. That would work just the same. The shovel, I don't understand having a shovel in The Legend of Zelda. It just gives you the flute. I don't see another reason for it. Quake Medallion, I have a big issue with the Quake Medallion just because the other 2 medallions are so cool. Quake only lets you get into Turtle Rock, and it basically turns your enemies into bouncing onions, and it doesn't actually kill anything, and I don't see, it could have been so much better than it is. And then finally, the boomerang. A lot of people don't like the boomerang in this game, or in most Zelda games. It gets a little better in Ocarina of Time, but I can see why. The boomerang has been completely dwarfed by the hookshot. I think the hookshot takes over for it. It's a shame. I like the boomerang in the first game, and it's sad to see that it's gotten so much weaker.
Number 4 best.
Although it sucks magic like nobody's business, and you only get a few shots out, the fire rod is one of my favorite items to use in this game. Setting things on fire is so satisfying, and you need it a lot for lighting lanterns and other things, so I'm definitely a big fan of the fire rod.
Number 4 worst.
The music in A Link to the Past is iconic. It is some of the best music in the Legend of Zelda series, and you'll see a lot of this music in future installments. But I feel that there's a few instances where they didn't go quite far enough. When you look at the dungeon themes for the Light World and the Dark World, these two tracks are amazing. They are extremely good tracks, but they replay it for each and every dungeon. In the Light World, you get 3 dungeons with the same music. In the Dark World, you actually get 8 dungeons with the same music. All 7 crystal dungeons and Ganon's Tower. I feel like they dropped the ball there because in the previous 2 Zeldas for the NES, you had the same dungeon music, yes, but at least in the final dungeon, you had a unique track. Grand Palace and Death Mountain both had unique music. They could have at least made Ganon's Tower have something unique, and I feel like that was a ball they dropped. And also, only one game later, in Link's Awakening, they made unique music for every dungeon in the game. And that could have added so much more atmosphere to these dungeons if they had just taken the Dark World dungeon theme and just maybe put it with Palace of Darkness and then made every other dungeon have unique music. Same thing with the Light World dungeons. I think it would have added so much to this game, and I understand that either the space or just the time that's committed to doing that, it just might not have been possible, but it's one of those regrets. It's one of those things I wish they would have had time to put in.
Number 3 best.
Before it became a cliche in a lot of the newer games, the Dark World, Light World mechanic was first introduced in Link to the Past, and I think it's one of the first instances of it being used. And in my opinion, it does it probably the best. I even look at a game like Ocarina of Time that does a very similar mechanic where you basically have a darker version of Hyrule 7 years later. But the problem with Ocarina of Time is that you have to always go back to the Temple of Time to activate that. Whereas Link to the Past, it allows you to have portals all throughout Hyrule, and the mirror, which instantly lets you go from the Dark World to the Light World. And that's just great for puzzles, and I think they do an awesome job. It's very fluid how you can go back and forth between these 2 dimensions.
Number 3 worst.
There are a lot of unique enemy varieties in A Link to the Past. I think every dungeon has at least one unique enemy, if not more. So it goes without saying that in a game like this, there's also going to be some that are annoying and not quite as fun to fight. So I figured I'd put a spot for all of those pain-in-the-ass enemies.
Number 2 best.
When I'm creating one of these lists for best and worst, I usually don't want something to be really broad. I like to make every item specific, or as specific as I possibly can, but I couldn't pick one boss from A Link to the Past that I've really liked more than the other ones. A Link to the Past has everything you would want from your bosses. They're big, intimidating, really challenging, have pretty good patterns overall. You've got Trinex, the Helmasaur King, Blind, Mothula. God, that fight is a big pain in the ass. There's just no way that I could narrow it down to just one of these. So, yeah, all of the bosses in Link to the Past, I think they deserve a place on this list.
Number 2 worst.
For a lot of you, Ice Palace is one of the least favorite dungeons in A Link to the Past, but for me, it's actually one of my favorite. It's probably my top 3. It's an opinion that is not shared by quite a few people, but I will say that the ice physics in A Link to the Past are beyond frustrating. It makes the dungeon so much harder than it needs to be, along with the conveyor belts and everything else. And in particular, going up and down stairs can be so frustrating. Using the sword, it allows you to get some momentum. You can actually use that to make it a little bit easier. But yeah, I completely agree with everybody who says the ice physics in the Link to the Past could have been fixed so they weren't quite as slippery as they are.
And the number 1 best.
I'm sure a lot of you saw this coming just based on my channel name, but the hookshot is my favorite item in the Link to the Past and was an obvious choice for number 1 best. It's actually a little overpowered. You can use it to go across pits, to traverse the landscape quicker. You can use it to collect items, to stun enemies, and beat certain enemies as well. It pretty much replaces the boomerang from the first game. If you remember the first Legend of Zelda, the boomerang could get items, but it also could kill certain enemies. The hookshot has completely replaced it, and it's the item that I always have along with my sword. If I'm not using another item for a certain situation, the hookshot is my go-to item in A Link to the Past.
And the number one worst.
I know you all expected to see Moldorm at some point in this video, and it shouldn't be a surprise that he arrived at the number one worst thing about A Link to the Past. Not only is he a troll for all of the first-time players of this game, and most of you will remember the first time he knocked you off the platform, again, and again, and again, and then you had to restart the fight each time. But even for speedrunners, for people who have played this game for hours and hours, he still trolls you. He's still Trolldorm and knocks you off the platform every once in a while. And it's amazing, and it just shows how unpredictable this boss is. So that's it for this episode of Best and Worst. Again, thank you guys so much for watching this whole video, and if you like what you saw, then subscribe below. And we actually have a Patreon set up for anybody who wants to support us further, so definitely take a look at that in the description below. Again, thank you guys, and I'll see you next time.